Short is the story, long is the life.
Wukong's archive presents China Urban Legends, the Bismarck Battery of Qingdao.
In the spring of 2004, I was transferred to work in Qingdao, and I lived on an old street at the foot of Qingdao Mountain. I can't tell you the name of that street. If I did, you'd be able to find it. What I can say is that the street was only 200 or 300 meters from the Bismarck Battery ruins. Standing at the window of the garret I rented, I could see the gray-blue stone wall halfway up Qingdao Mountain.
The story I'm telling today is one that Mountain told me. Let me start with where I live. It's a 100-year-old courtyard compound. Qingdao's old town is full of these things, a ring of 2 or 3-story red brick buildings enclosing a square courtyard in the middle, like an upside-down well. The courtyard is strung with clotheslines covered with sheets, underpants, dried fish. When the wind blows, they flap and rattle. My room is at the corner on the second floor, facing north. Outside the window is the slope of Qingdao Mountain. In summer the window is full of locust leaves, in winter only bare branches are left, and the mountain shows itself. The landlord's surname is Zhou, full name Zhou Dihai, 67 years old. He's a Qingdao local with a thick Jiaodong accent. I call him Old Zhou. When he was young, Old Zhou watched over the woods on Qingdao Mountain. After he retired he couldn't sit still, he still heads up the mountain every day, a machete tucked at his waist, saying it's for keeping snakes away. He has a habit, every evening he squats in the courtyard for a smoke. When he's done, he stubs the butt out on the sole of his shoe, looks up at the mountain for a while, then goes back inside to sleep. On the third day after I moved in, he was squatting in the courtyard when he suddenly asked me, "Xiao Yang, have you heard any noises at night?"
I said no, I sleep fine. He nodded and said, "Good that you haven't. If you do hear something, don't answer it." I asked, "What noises?"
He didn't take it up. He lit another cigarette and pointed at the mountain. In there, there's a bell.
I thought he meant a church bell. Qingdao's old town has plenty of churches. That Christian church on Jiangsu Road, pointed bell tower, built by the Germans, nearly 100 years old, still rings on the hour. I said, "The church bell? I've heard it. It's nice."
Old Joe shook his head. "Not that one. That one's for the living to hear. The one in the mountain," he paused, "is for the mountain to hear. Once you've heard it, you'll never forget it."
I didn't take it to heart at the time. Qingdao, it's a coastal city, the wind is strong, it howls all night, there's all kinds of noise. I took his words for one of those stories old Qingdao locals tell to spook outsiders. What really got me thinking about this mountain was something that happened over a month later.
At the end of May, my work unit organized a tour of the Qingdao Mountain Fortress ruins. That was the first time I'd properly gone into the mountain. The mountain isn't tall, just over 100 meters above sea level, but the trees are dense. Walking up the winding road, the locust trees and black locusts on both sides blocked out the sky completely, sunlight leaking through and scattering silver coins all over the ground. Halfway up was that famous underground fortress, the Bismarck fort built by the Germans back then.
Before the tour, the guide gave us a history lesson, and I remember it very clearly.
On November 14, 1897, Germany used the Jui incident as a pretext and sent troops to occupy Qingdao. The next year, the Qing government signed the Jiaozhou Bay lease treaty with Germany, leasing Qingdao to them for 99 years. The Germans treated this place as their stronghold in the Far East, starting massive construction projects, building a port, a railway, military barracks, and they hollowed out the entire mountain. Qingdao Mountain, the Germans called it Bismarck Mountain. They built 2 forts up there, a south fort and a north fort with the cannon mouths aimed at the sea at Jiaozhou Bay. Inside the mountain's belly were 3 levels of underground fortifications: command posts, ammunition depots, soldiers' quarters, generator rooms, medical stations. The tunnels branched in every direction, said to be over 2,000 meters long in total. The Germans worked this mountain for 17 years, turning a stone mountain into an iron fortress.
When the guide got to this part, she pointed at the ground beneath our feet. The spot we're standing on right now is the old command post. Everyone, follow me this way. Watch your step, the stairs are slippery.
We followed her underground. The lights were dim and yellow. The tunnels were built from granite, with arched ceilings. Standing inside, you could hear your own heartbeat. The walls still had bullet marks from back then, and words carved by German soldiers, twisting crooked German script. I was at the back of the group when I suddenly felt a cold sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was right up against me, blowing on it. I looked back. Behind me was empty, just that lamp at the corner of the tunnel, its bulb swaying gently in the breeze.
That night, back at the courtyard house, old Joe was squatting in the courtyard, smoking. He asked me, "You went and saw it?"
I said I did. He blew out a puff of smoke. What did you see?
I said I saw the command post, the ammunition depot, and the words carved on the wall by German soldiers.
Old Joe let out an then said, "They showed you what they were supposed to show you. What they didn't take you to see, there's a lot more of that." I asked him, "What do you mean, what they didn't take me to see?" He stubbed out his cigarette butt, then looked up at the mountain. The sky was fully black by then. Qingdao Mountain was a dark, lumpy mass, with only 2 streetlights glowing up near the ruins halfway up the slope, like 2 open eyes.
Inside this mountain, he said, there's a tunnel that's sealed off. It was sealed the year the Germans surrendered. 100 years now, and no one's ever opened it. The tunnel old Joe talked about, you have to go back to 1914 to understand. In August 1914, the First World War broke out. Japan declared war on Germany, sent over 60,000 troops, plus a British battalion, and landed at Lausanne, pushing all the way toward Qingdao. The German garrison had only 4,000 men, plus some Austrian sailors, at the very most under 5,000. For 1,000 against 60,000, the outcome was never in doubt from the start, but the Germans fought with extreme toughness. In September, the Japanese took Litsuan and closed in on the city. In October, the 2 sides fought back and forth around the outskirts. By early November, the Germans had pulled their lines back to the city and the coastline, and Qingdao Mountain Fortress became one of their last strongholds. The Japanese concentrated artillery fire on Qingdao Mountain. They say the soil up there was turned over 3 times, and the trees were burned completely bare. In the early hours of November 7th, the Japanese launched their final assault. That day was a Friday. It was still dark, and a thick fog had settled over the sea. The Japanese climbed up the north slope of Qingdao Mountain and met the Germans in bayonet-to-bayonet combat in the trenches. The phone lines in the fortress were cut, the artillery lost their observers, and shells went flying everywhere. By dawn, Qingdao Mountain had fallen. That same morning, the German line collapsed entirely. On the evening of November 7th, the German commander Meyer Waldeck formally surrendered. The surrender ceremony was held in the city. That afternoon, the sky over Qingdao was black with clouds. Japanese warships sat on the sea, and the rising sun flags on their masts snapped in the wind. The German troops marched out of the fortress in formation, weapons confiscated, heads drooping, walking from Guanxiang Hill all the way to Huiquan Bay. On both sides of the road stood the people of Qingdao. No one said a word, they just watched quietly. An old man later recalled that as those German soldiers walked, men in the ranks kept turning their heads back toward Qingdao Mountain, all along the way. That look in their eyes wasn't like they were looking at the fort they'd held for 17 years. It was more like they were waiting for somebody to come chasing out of the mountains. On the night before the surrender, the Germans did something strange. They destroyed most of their heavy artillery, pushed crates upon crates of ammunition into the sea, and burned what they could of the archives and buried the rest. Old Joe said his grandfather had worked as a laborer on the Qingdao docks back then, and saw with his own eyes German soldiers using military trucks to haul things down to the shore. Truckload after truckload, still hauling after dark. What they were hauling, no one knew. The old-timers at the docks all said the Germans sank the best equipment into the sea, refusing to leave the Japanese a single bullet. But what Old Joe's grandfather said was different from what the old-timers passed down. The old-timers' version was this: on those nights, the Germans up on Qingdao Mountain carried things into the deepest tunnels, and they carried for 3 straight nights. On the morning of the surrender, when the German troops pulled out of the fortress did a head count, 1 whole squad was missing. The officer leading them panicked and wanted to go back to find them, but his superiors held him back. The Japanese were already in the mountains. If they didn't leave now, none of them would make it out.
That squad was never seen again.
Later, the Japanese took over the fortress. They searched the tunnels for 3 days and reached the deepest part, where they found an iron door bolted shut from the inside. The Japanese used explosives. They blasted it 3 times, but the door didn't budge. Then, for whatever reason, they stopped. They bricked that tunnel up completely and hung a sign at the entrance that said, "No entry."
When Old Joe got to this part, he stubbed his cigarette butt into the spittoon and said, the Japanese didn't dare open it either. For 100 years, no one knows what's behind that door. The bell you heard at night, he looked at me, it comes from behind that door. The night I truly heard that bell was one night in June. That day I worked overtime until late. It was past 11 when I walked out of the office. Summer nights in Qingdao are cool. The sea breeze blew over from Zhangqiao Pier, carrying a salty, fishy smell. I was heading back along the old street, and when I reached the alley at the entrance of the courtyard building, I suddenly stopped. Someone was striking a bell. Not the clear, time-keeping bell of a church, it was a different kind. Dull. Muffled. Like a chunk of iron dropping into deep water, gudong, and then a long trailing reverberation that buzzed and drilled into the seams of your bones. The sound wasn't loud, but it was extremely distinct, as if it were right above my head, and at the same time as if it were coming up from underground, separated by a mountain. I looked up instinctively. On both sides of the alley stood pitch-black courtyard walls, locust branches and leaves poking out over the tops. Above me there was only a thin slice of sky, grayish-blue, with a few stars. The sound was coming from the direction of Qingdao Mountain. Dong. Another one. Then it stopped. About half a minute later, dong, the third. 3 rings. No more, no less. Exactly 3. I stood in the alley, my spine tingling numb in waves. It wasn't fear, it was that unnameable feeling of being watched by something. I walked faster, through the courtyard gate, up the stairs, unlocked the door, locked it again, all in one stretch. Once I was in bed, it took a long time for my heartbeat to settle. Early the next morning, I ran into Old Joe in the courtyard. He was squatting there brushing his teeth. Seeing me, he rinsed his mouth and asked, "You heard it?"
I was taken aback. Heard what? He smiled, eyes narrowing into slits. It's written on your face. Didn't sleep well last night, did you?
I didn't answer.
He said, don't be scared. Let it ring its ring, and you sleep your sleep. 3 rings means it's reporting that all is well. If it ever rings without stopping, he paused, that's when there's real trouble. I asked, so what bell is it, exactly?
Old Joe wiped his mouth and said, "The old folks say that back then the Germans built a fortress inside the mountain. In the deepest part, they made a bell room and hung a great bronze bell. German soldiers stood watch in there. When the bell rang, it meant changing the guard, telling the time, or handing down orders. The year the Japanese invaded, the Germans surrendered, bolted the door, and the bell never rang again."
Then what was ringing last night? Old Joe looked at me for a good while, then said, how would I know? I'm not the mountain.
That said, he took his toothbrush cup and went upstairs. I stood in the courtyard. On the clothesline overhead, a salted fish swayed back and forth in the wind. Old Joe's father, Joe Haishan, was a veteran of the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea. In 1956 he was transferred back to Qingdao and went into the Air Defense Department.
In the 1950s, the whole country was building civil air defense works. Qingdao Mountain Fortress was reopened as a ready-made bomb shelter. The engineer company Joe Haishan was responsible for clearing the fortress tunnels, reinforcing the arches, and restoring ventilation. Old Joe said his father once told him about something, only that one time in his whole life. That was in the autumn of 1957. The engineer company cleared to the deepest part of the fortress. Using flashlights, they made their way through a collapse zone and found an iron door. The door was cast iron, chest-high, with patterns cast into the panels. In the middle of the patterns was a line of text. Joe Haishan didn't recognize German, but he said those characters didn't have the same strokes as Chinese characters. Square and neat, like little nails hammered into the iron. The door had no lock, but it wouldn't push open, and rust filled the gaps like it had been welded shut.
The company commander had the soldiers pry it with crowbars. They worked for half the morning, and the door didn't move an inch. Joe Haishan squatted by the door to rest, and suddenly heard something moving behind it. He thought it was a comrade on the other side, so he called out, "Anybody in there?" No one answered. He called again. This time he heard clearly, it wasn't a human voice. It was knocking. 1, 2, 3. Very slow, very heavy, like someone behind the door was hitting the iron with something, one strike at a time. Joe Haishan was in his 20s then, full of hot blood, and he didn't believe in superstition. He grabbed his crowbar, banged it against the door 3 times as bam, 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 and shouted, "Who is it? Say something." It went quiet behind the door. After about a minute, a very soft sound came from behind the door, like a sigh. Then the knocking started again, this time not 3 strikes, but many, dense and urgent, as if someone were rapping rapidly on the door with their knuckles, from one end of the door all the way to the other, and then back again. Joe Haishan later said that at that moment he felt his scalp tighten. That wasn't a person knocking. A person knocking on a door couldn't make that sound, too dense, without a single gap, like water seeping out through the crack of the door. He ran back and called the company commander. The commander brought people over, and they stood around the door listening for a long time but heard nothing. The commander said Joe Haishan was having auditory hallucinations, staying on the mountain so long, the wind had gotten into his ears. But the commander kept it in mind anyway. The next day, the company headquarters reported to higher-ups, and the higher-ups' instruction was just one word: seal it. The engineer company bricked up that tunnel until it was over 2 meters thick, then poured a layer of concrete on the outside. Before Joe Haishan was discharged, he went back to look once. The brick wall was still there, and a patch of water stains was seeping through the newly poured concrete, cold to the touch.
Old Joe told me all this, then paused for a moment and said, "My dad was tough his whole life, made it through gunfire and explosions. Just that once, he told me, 'Di-hi, behind that door, there's no person there.'" I asked, then the sound he heard. Old Joe waved his hand. My dad never said. He never mentioned it again afterward. He passed away when I was 18. Half a month before he went, he suddenly brought it up one more time. He said, "The one behind the door has been knocking all along." In 57, I knocked back 3 times, and he knew. He knew there was someone out there.
The second strange thing happened at Badogwan. In July of that year, one of my college classmates came to Qingdao on a business trip and stayed in Badogwan. In the evening, with nothing to do, the 2 of us strolled along the seaside. We walked to Huanghai Road and saw a villa that looked like a stone castle, 3 stories, gray-white granite, a pointed roof, and narrow windows like the eye slits of a pillbox. That was the Flower Stone House.
My classmate said, "This building is famous. Chiang Kai-shek and Dai Li both stayed here." I looked up. The building was dark, except for one window on the westernmost side of the third floor, where a dim yellow light was showing.
I said, "Someone still lives there?"
My classmate looked up too. He looked for a while, then said, "That's strange. Hasn't this building been off limits for ages? I came to tour it during the day. It's empty inside." The two of us stood across the street, watching that window with the light on. The curtains were drawn, so we couldn't see anyone inside, but the light stayed on, yellow, completely still. After about 10 minutes, the curtain suddenly moved, as if someone had pulled it open a crack from inside, looking out. Then it closed again. My classmate pulled me along, saying as we walked, come on, don't look. I've heard this building has a cursed streak."
I asked him what it was about.
He said he'd heard it from his local Qingdao co-workers. The Flower Stone House was built in 1930, originally constructed by a Russian, and changed hands several times over the years. In March 1946, Dai Li came to Qingdao on business and stayed at the Flower Stone House. He stayed 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, he flew back to Nanjing from Qingdao. The plane hit a mountain near Nanjing and he was gone. They say that on the night before he left, the light in that third-floor study burned all night long.
Ever since then, the light in that room has never been turned off again, my classmate said. In the daytime you can't see it, but come night, it's always on. Some say the electric light is broken. They've changed the bulb any number of times, and it'll work for a while, then turn itself back on. Others say. He didn't finish.
I looked back over my shoulder. The Flower Stone House was already far away. The light in that third-floor window was still burning, like a single eye in the darkness. The next day, I told this to Old Joe. Old Joe listened, smoked half a cigarette, and said, "The Flower Stone House, huh? Underneath that building, something is buried."
I asked what was buried there.
He said, "Have you ever heard that this whole area of Badagwan, before liberation, was a graveyard? The Germans came, fenced the land off, moved the graves away, and built villas. When they moved the graves, some weren't dug out completely. Old-timers say that the foundation of the Flower Stone House. Underneath it sits a grave that was never moved. Once the building was finished, it made trouble every year, and the worst of it was always in that West End room on the 3rd floor. Then what does that have to do with Dai Li?" Old Joe smiled. "Think about it. Who was Dai Li? What did he do for a living? The room he stayed in faces the sea directly, faces that direction." He raised his hand and pointed east. "That's Zhongshan Park. Taiping Mountain."
What about Taiping Mountain?
Taiping Mountain, the Germans hollowed that out too. Inside it is the Iltis Fort, a pair with Qingdao Mountain. Back then they dug the earth out of Qingdao Mountain to fill the gully by Taiping Mountain. The two mountains are connected underneath. Old folks say Qingdao Mountain and Taiping Mountain are two ends tied to the same rope. When one end rings, the other rings along with it. Around that time, I started going through Qingdao's local chronicles and old newspapers.
The city library was on Zhongshan Road, an old building. In the reading room sat a few old men with reading glasses, flipping through newspapers with a rustle. I searched for nearly 2 weeks, going through every piece of material I could find about Qingdao Mountain.
In November 1914, after the Japanese army captured the Qingdao Mountain fortress, they did indeed search the mountain. A Japanese war correspondent wrote a passage in the record of the occupation of Qingdao. At the deepest point of the fortress, they discovered an iron door that could not be opened. They judged it to be a German military supply depot, and so sealed it shut with bricks and stone. This was a clear, documented record. The matter of the iron door was real. In 1922, the Beiyang government recovered Qingdao. In 1938, Japan occupied Qingdao for the second time. In 1945, Japan surrendered, and the nationalists took over. On June 2, 1949, Qingdao was liberated. In the decades in between, the use of the Qingdao mountain fortress kept changing. One moment it was an ammunition depot, the next an air defense command post, and sometimes it sat empty, overgrown with weeds. Interestingly, I came across a 1958 archive document, a report written to a higher authority from the Municipal Air Defense Office. It was in penmanship, very neat handwriting. The report mentioned, the wall sealing the end of Tunnel Number 3 on Qingdao Mountain was verified to have been built by the Japanese in 1914. The wall is more than 2 meters thick, and the condition of the interior is unknown. During construction work in 1957, several soldiers reported hearing strange noises from within the wall. A follow-up inspection by the company found nothing abnormal, and the reports were treated as auditory hallucinations. Recommendation: maintain the status quo. Do not reopen.
Treated as auditory hallucinations. I copied that line into my notebook and stared at it for a long time. 1957, an engineer company, strange noises, this matched what old Joe's father had said.
But there was another sentence in the archive that made my heart skip a beat. At the end of the report was a line of small print, as if added later. Additionally, according to Japanese materials from 1942, the iron door at the end of that tunnel had been bolted shut by the Germans from the inside. The Japanese attempted to blast it open twice, both without success, and the door showed no damage. 2 blasting attempts, unsuccessful. In 1914, the Japanese had blown it 3 times. In 1942, the Japanese tried again. Neither could get it open. An iron door, 100 years, 2 generations of invaders, and no one had ever managed to open it. I wouldn't give up, so I went back to check the 1942 materials. During Japan's second occupation of Qingdao, they had reactivated the Qingdao mountain fortress as an air defense fortification. In the autumn of 1942, when Japanese engineers were clearing the tunnels, they rediscovered that same iron door. The Japanese army was suffering defeat after defeat in the Pacific Theater at the time, scavenging steel from wherever they could. When they saw this cast iron door, they grew greedy. They wanted to tear it down, melt it, and use it for steel production.
According to the story, on the day they dismantled the door, the Japanese engineers set up their cutting torch. They had barely made one cut when, suddenly, the sound of a bell rang out from behind the door. The bell sound amplified through the tunnel, shaking dirt loose from overhead. Every Japanese soldier present froze. The officer in charge came to his senses and ordered them to keep cutting. The second cut went in, and the bell grew louder, and it wasn't just one bell. It sounded like dozens of bells ringing at once behind that door, clanging again and again, sending the whole tunnel vibrating with the din. The Japanese soldiers dropped their cutting torch and ran. Afterward, the door was sealed up again, and the Japanese never mentioned dismantling it again. In 1945, Japan surrendered, Qingdao was liberated, and this secret was buried back inside the mountain once more. The third witness was Old Yu. Old Yu was a taxi driver, in his 50s, who had worked the night shift for 20 years. I met him one time when I hailed a cab late at night. That day I came out of work, and it was drizzling. His cab was parked at the curb. I opened the door, got in, and told him a place name.
He grunted and pulled out. After 2 blocks, he suddenly glanced at me in the rearview mirror and asked, "You live over by Qingdao Mountain?" I said yes. He said, "Not many night drivers go that way. It's out of the way. Not many people around at night." I said I was used to it.
He didn't say anything more. When the cab pulled up to the entrance of Liyuan Alley, I paid and got out. He suddenly called after me, "Hey, young fella." I turned around.
He hesitated, then said, "You live over there. At night, if you hear any sounds, bell sounds, footsteps, anything like that, don't make a fuss, and don't go looking. Hear me?"
The rain flew slantwise through the headlights. I said, "Master driver, you've heard it too?" He didn't answer directly. He lit a cigarette and said, "I drove passengers there once. 1997, late autumn. That night the rain was heavier than this. I was parked by the pier waiting for fares when 3 passengers got in. All of them wore gray uniforms, like work clothes issued by some unit. The old man in the middle had to be over 70, with hair completely white. He said, "Master, Qingdao Mountain."
I drove them to the foot of the mountain. The old man handed me a bill. I looked at it under the dome light. It was a silver dollar, the kind from the Republic era, with Yuan Shirkai's head on it. I said I couldn't make change. The old man said, "No change needed." The 3 of them got out and headed up the mountain.
I thought to myself, what are 3 old men doing going into the mountain this late at night? I made a U-turn and parked by the roadside for a while, wanting to see if they'd gotten lost. The rain was too heavy to see clearly. I just saw 3 shadows, step by step, walking up the mountain. When they reached that stone wall halfway up, they vanished.
Later I drove them once more. Also at night, also raining, also 3 people, also gray uniforms, also that old man. Got in, gave the place name, Qingdao Mountain. Got out, gave me a silver dollar. I weighed that silver dollar in my hand. Cold. I asked him, "Uncle, where did you get this silver dollar?" The old man looked at me and said, "German goods." When you got to this point, he stubbed out his cigarette and said, "Later I had someone look at that silver dollar. A knowledgeable person said it was minted during the Guangxu reign, made by Germans in Qingdao. A dragon on the front, an eagle on the back. They haven't been in circulation for ages. You'd only find them in museums."
I asked him how much it was worth. He said, "Hard to say, depends on who's buying." I said the old man gave me 2 of them in one night. The man stared at me for a long time and said, "Those passengers you drove, were they living people, or?"
You didn't finish. He started the engine. Before driving off, he rolled down the window and said, "Young fella, those 2 silver dollars of mine, I donated them to the museum later. I figured, if that old man still needed a ride, maybe he could still find me. But he never came again. 3 years now."
I asked you, what did that old man look like? Do you remember clearly? You thought for a moment and said, "Tall, with a straight back. Walked with a brisk stride, didn't seem like a man past 70. His face was very pale, not the pale of someone who'd been out in the sun, but the pallor of someone who'd never seen daylight, skin that had been kept covered in gone white. The strangest thing was his eyes. The irises were gray-blue. Around Qingdao, with all the old mixed-blood families, gray-blue eyes aren't unusual. But those eyes of his, when they looked at you, you felt like the whole of you was seen through. Whatever you were thinking, you couldn't hide it. And the gray uniform he wore?
Gray, double-breasted, made of thick material, not ordinary work clothes. The collar was buttoned up tight. Even the hook and eye at the neck was fastened. Later I saw old photographs of German soldiers in the museum. That outfit was exactly the same as in the photos.
The cab drove off, its taillights blinking on and off through the rain. I stood at the mouth of the alley, raindrops falling on my face, cold and damp. I suddenly remembered what old Joe had said, "The ones behind that door, they've been knocking all along."
Gray uniforms. Guangxu silver dollars. German goods. 100 years ago, the German soldiers' uniforms were gray.
One night in August that year, old Joe suddenly knocked on my door. I opened it, and he stood there in his washed-out blue cloth jacket, a machete tucked at his waist, holding an old-fashioned kerosene lantern. The lamp wasn't lit, and the glass shade was polished bright.
He said, "Come on. Up the mountain." I said, "In the middle of the night? What for?" He said, "You've always wanted to hear that bell, haven't you? I'll take you to hear it."
I hesitated. To be honest, I was scared. But old Joe had already turned and headed downstairs, his footsteps thudding on the steps. I gritted my teeth and followed. Old Joe didn't go through the front gate. He led me around to the back of the inner courtyard, climbed over a low wall, and stepping through a patch of weeds, we were in the mountain. He walked fast, like a cat, where to lift his foot, where to duck his head, he knew with his eyes closed. I followed behind him, stumbling this way and that, locust branches scratching my face, not daring to make a sound. We didn't go toward the fort ruins, there were lights and guards over there. Old Joe took me along the west slope, and after a while, stopped in front of a patch of bushes. He parted the brush, revealing a pitch-black opening, about waist-high, square-shaped, with worn-down granite edges.
A ventilation shaft, he said. The Germans built it for air circulation. During the civil defense conversion in the 50s, this shaft was abandoned and welded shut with iron bars. Later the bars rusted through and were pried off and hauled away by scrap pickers.
He crouched down, tilted his ear to listen for a moment, then waved me over. I lay down at the opening and, copying him, tilted my ear. At first, I couldn't hear a thing. Wind blew out from the shaft, carrying a smell of mildew and earth. I lay there for about 2 minutes, my ear going numb, and was just about to get up. Dong. Very faint, very far away, as if it came up from the center of the earth. Not a bell sound, more like something striking iron, a dull, muffled thud. I held my breath. Dong. About 5 seconds later, another one. Then dong, a third. 3 strikes. Then 3 more. I looked up at old Joe. In the dark I couldn't make out his expression, only his eyes bright, staring at the opening without blinking. Suddenly he raised 2 fingers to his lips, making a sure gesture. Then he did something I never would have dreamed of. He reached his hand into the opening, and on the edge of the granite, lightly but firmly, knocked 3 times. Dong, dong, dong. I was frozen stiff. I remembered his father's story. In 1957, Joe Haitian knocked back 3 times on the iron gate with a crowbar, and then, from behind the door, came a dense, urgent flurry of knocking. The sound in the shaft stopped. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. The mountain wind howled into the shaft, and I heard my own heartbeat, asterisk thump 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 asterisk, like a war drum. Then, from inside the shaft, a sound came back. Not a bell. Not a knock. Footsteps. Extremely light, orderly footsteps, like a line of people wearing hard-soled shoes, marching in step on a stone floor, 1 step, 1 step, 1 step, growing closer, from far to near. They stopped directly beneath the opening. In the darkness, old Joe's hand pressed down hard on my shoulder. Neither of us moved. Neither of us made a sound. That line of people stood under the opening for a long time. So long I thought I must have misheard. Then, suddenly, a very faint sigh drifted up from the opening, and the footsteps started again, step by step, fading into the distance, vanishing into the depths of the mountain. Old Joe let go of my shoulder, stepped back 2 paces, and dropped onto the grass, not saying a word for a long while.
I crawled over and whispered, just now, what was? He waved his hand, his voice a little hoarse. Don't ask. Even if you asked, I wouldn't know. I've watched this mountain for 40 years, and this is the first time it's answered me. Then why did you knock those 3 times? He was silent for a long time, then said, my father knocked. I figured, if it still remembers him, maybe it would come out and see me. Did it come out?
Old Joe didn't answer. He stood up, brushed the grass clippings off his pants, and said, let's go down the mountain. Still have work tomorrow. We headed back. As we walked out through the bushes, I looked back at the opening. It was pitch black, like the mouth of the mountain. Wind blew out from inside, woo, woo like the mountain sighing.
That night I had a dream. In the dream I stood before an iron gate, its surface cast with patterns, and in the middle of the patterns ran a line of square, blocky script. I didn't recognize it, but I knew it was German. Someone behind the door was speaking. I couldn't understand what they said, but the voice was soft and level, like someone reading a letter. I reached out to push the door, and a sliver of light leaked through the crack. Then I woke up. I woke drenched in sweat. Outside the window, the sky was just turning gray with dawn. Qingdao Mountain stood in the morning mist, quiet and still, as if nothing had ever happened.
Later on, old Joe and I got close, and he told me quite a few old Qingdao sayings.
Old Qingdao locals don't call that bell a bell. They call it the church bell. But the church is on Jiangsu Road and the bell is on the mountain, with a ridgeline separating the two places. Yet people still stubbornly call it the church bell. Old Joe said the story passed down from the older generation goes like this. Back when the Germans built the Qingdao mountain fortifications, they sank a great bronze bell deep into the mountain's belly. That bell was donated by a German church, and cast into its body were an image of the Virgin Mary and a ring of German text, roughly meaning, "Whoever hears my voice shall find rest." Germans believed in that, old Joe said. They thought a bell could suppress the mountain. There was something under the mountain, and they knew it. They built gun batteries on the mountain not to defend against the sea, but to pin down whatever was under it.
I asked, "What's under the mountain?" Old Joe said, "Have you ever heard of Taiping Mountain?" I said I had. It was the mountain behind Zhongshan Park.
Right. Taiping Mountain. The old folks call it Zhongshan, the suppressing mountain. They say when the Germans dug into Qingdao Mountain back then, all the stones and earth they dug out were hauled over to Taiping Mountain. Beneath Taiping Mountain is pressed whatever the Germans dug out from under Qingdao Mountain. What was it? Nobody knows. All anyone knows is that after that, Taiping Mountain hasn't been peaceful. The flowers in Zhongshan Park, year after year they plant them, year after year they die, except on that northern slope of Taiping Mountain. There, no matter how you plant, it grows, and it grows unnaturally. Deep winter and it's still lush and green. And there's more. He lowered his voice. The old Qingdao folks talked about feng shui. This place, Qingdao, is a turtle's back. Taiping Mountain is the turtle's head, Qingdao Mountain is the turtle's shell, and Tuandao is the turtle's tail. The Germans understood that. They built their gun batteries on the shell and their church on the head, pinning both ends, and that turtle could never turn over. But
what?
But a turtle is a living thing. You press down on it, it can't turn over, but it can still breathe. That bell. That's the sound of it breathing.
As I listened, a chill ran up my spine. Old Joe's words sounded like superstition, but when I thought of that ventilation shaft, thought of that perfectly neat row of footsteps from below the opening, I felt those words weren't so simple.
What about the bell at the Jiangsu Road Church, then? I asked. That one's a real church bell, isn't it? That one's real, old Joe said. That bell tower is over 100 years old. But have you ever noticed that bell never rings on the hour?
I was taken aback and thought back. It was true. I'd been living in Qingdao for almost half a year, and the bell at the Jiangsu Road Church always seemed to ring around the half-hour mark, never right on the hour.
Why? Old Joe said, according to the old folks, the church bell and the bell in the mountain are a pair. A paired set of bells cannot ring at the same time. When the one in the mountain rings, the one at the church holds back. When the one at the church rings, the one in the mountain rests. All these years, have you ever heard them ring together?
I thought about it and shook my head.
Old Joe smiled and said, there you have it. Two bells, one on the mountain, one at its foot, separated by a ridgeline, watching over one city. 100 years now, and the two of them have never once laid eyes on each other.
In the winter of 2006, I was transferred back to my hometown. The day I left Qingdao, old Zhou walked me to the entrance of the alley. He stood under the locust tree, waved at me, and said, "Xiao Yang, come back when you have time. The mountain's still there, and the bell's still there."
I said okay. Little did I think, the next time I went back would be 2011.
That autumn, I passed through Qingdao on a business trip and went out of my way to see old Zhou. He had aged. His back was hunched, his hair was completely white, but he still wore that blue cloth jacket. When he saw me, he was very happy and busied himself with making me a meal. At the dinner table, he told me something.
In the spring of 2011, the city was doing civil air defense project renovations and reorganizing the Qingdao mountain fortress. While clearing out tunnel number 3, the construction crew discovered that the cracks in the brickwork of that sealed wall were filled with tree roots. The wall had already turned brittle, one push and it would collapse. After studying the situation, the higher-ups decided to tear the wall open and see what was actually inside.
Old Zhou went on the day they opened it. He said his father had muttered about it his whole life, and he wanted to see it for his father. Behind the wall was a tunnel, not long, about 20 meters. At the end of it was that iron door.
100 years had passed, and the iron door was still there. The patterns on it had rusted into lumps, but that line of German writing could still be faintly made out. The construction crew tried with hydraulic jacks, then with crowbars, and struggled all afternoon. Toward evening, the door let out a creak and opened a crack.
The door opened inward. The hinges had rusted solid long ago. It had been forced open. As soon as the door opened, a gust of air rushed out, carrying an indescribable smell, not mold, but that smell when an old trunk is opened, mixed with rust, dust, and a faint trace of something like the lingering scent after candles have burned. When the flashlight shone in, everyone was stunned. Behind the door was a complete basement. Not big, about a dozen square meters, with granite walls and an arched ceiling. Against the wall stood an iron frame camp bed. The bedding on it was folded neatly, an army green blanket, squared off, as if just tidied. Beside the bed was a wooden table. On the table sat a kerosene lamp, its glass shade polished spotless. There was also an open book on the table, its pages yellowed and brittle, the edges curled up. In the corner stood a sheet iron cabinet. The door was half open. When they pulled it open, inside hung a military uniform. Gray, double-breasted, with unintelligible symbols on the shoulder boards. Under the uniform, neatly arranged, sat a pair of leather boots, polished to a gleam. 100 years later, they could still reflect a person's image.
The crew members buzzed with discussion. Some said it was a German soldier's dormitory. Others said it was a storeroom. Old Zhou didn't say anything. He walked to the table, picked up the open book, looked at it for a long time, then suddenly said, "This is a diary." Everyone gathered around. The diary was in German, in winding cursive script, and nobody could read it. Later, a teacher from the German department at Qingdao University was brought in to translate it. Most of the book was routine military matters. Today it was windy, tomorrow guard duty, the day after black bread, so-and-so was homesick.
Only the last page had handwriting different from the rest, much more hurried, as if written in a rush. The translator said that page read,
November 7th. The fighting is still going on up above. The cannon fire is getting closer. The lieutenant ordered us down to the lowest level to hold this door. He said when the bell rings 3 times, that means the order has arrived, and we go out. We've bolted the door from the inside. The bell hasn't rung yet. We're waiting.
When old Zhou got to this point, he paused, poured himself a glass of liquor, and downed it in one go.
I asked him, and then? The door opened, was there anyone in there? Old Zhou shook his head. No one. The basement was empty, just those things. the bedding, the uniform, the boots, the diary, the kerosene lamp, and he paused. A bell. A bell?
A small bronze bell, the size of a fist, hung on the door frame. Bronze, rusted green. The crew took it down and wiped it off. A ring of words was cast around the bell, also in German. The translator looked at it and said it was a church bell, with an image of the Virgin Mary engraved on it, and a line of text.
Whoever hears my voice, let them rest in peace, I said.
Old Joe looked at me and nodded.
That bell, he said, disappeared that very night. The crew put it on the table in the duty room, and by the next morning it was gone. They checked the surveillance, the camera in that duty room, that night, showed nothing but static. It didn't record anything at all. Who took it?
Old Joe didn't answer. He stood up, walked to the window, looked at Qingdao Mountain in the distance, and said, that month, several of the old residents around Qingdao Mountain heard bell sounds at night. Not from a church, from the mountain. It rang 3 times. Just 3. Then it never rang again.
Never again? Never again.
He turned to look at me and said, Xiaoyang, tell me, those German soldiers, did they ever get their order? In 2013, the Qingdao Mountain Fortress site was renovated and reopened. I went to see it once. The new exhibition hall was quite grand. Display boards, lighting, audio guides, everything you could ask for. I followed the crowd through, saw plenty of old photographs. The landing of 1897, the artillery fire of 1914, group photos of German soldiers, maps of the fortress. The guide's voice echoed through the tunnels while tourists held up their phones, snapping pictures. Camera flashes going off one after another.
At the end of the tunnel, an iron gate blocked the way. A sign hung on it, restricted area ahead, visitors stop here. The gate was new, the welds shiny. A new lock hung on it, and tied to the hasp was a red cloth strip, drifting gently in the light. I stood before the gate and looked for a long time. Tourists came and went in waves, and nobody noticed the red cloth strip. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, when an old man in a security uniform walked over and waved his hand, saying, "No photos here."
I said sorry. Then asked him, "Master, what's behind this?" The old man said, "The old tunnel. Sealed off." I pointed at the red cloth strip. "Then this." The old man glanced at me, lowered his voice, and said, "That bell in there, it still rings on the hour. In the dead of night, dawn, 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 3 times. Hanging a red cloth strip on the bell is for good luck, to keep that one in there calm." "That one in there?"
The old man waved his hand, refusing to say more, and turned to walk away. I stood before the iron gate and suddenly felt a chill run down my back. I checked my watch, 2:50 in the afternoon. 10 more minutes until exactly 3. I wandered through the exhibition hall again. At exactly 3, I made a point of circling back to that tunnel. Behind the iron gate, it was pitch black. Nothing could be seen. I held my breath and stood there for about a minute. All that came from the tunnel was the hum of the ventilation ducts and the distant chatter of visitors. Nothing. I let out a breath of relief and was just about to turn and leave. Dong. 1. Extremely faint, extremely distant, as if rising from the very core of the earth, through the mountain, through the soil, through that iron door 100 years old. The tourists were still laughing and talking. No one heard it. Only me, standing before the iron gate, completely still. Dong. A second one. Dong. A third. 3 times. No more, no less, exactly 3. Then, everything fell into silence. I walked out of the exhibition hall, the sunlight outside so bright it made your eyes squint. Tourists in Zhongshan Park were flying kites, the kites in the sky all colorful, floating above Taiping Mountain. I stood at the foot of the mountain and looked up at Taiping Mountain for a while. The mountain was very quiet, covered in green trees from top to bottom. When the wind blew, the leaves rustled, like someone up on the mountain talking. On the train back to my hometown, I called Old Joe. He answered, his voice very low.
I said, Old Joe, I went to Qingdao Mountain today. He said, I said, I heard it. 3 times.
Silence on the other end of the line for a long time, so long I thought the signal had dropped. Then he suddenly said, Little Yang, when my old man was dying, he told me something. He said, behind that door, someone has always been knocking. Not trying to get out, just afraid the people outside have forgotten them.
Forgotten who? Forgotten that there are still people buried under the mountain.
The year they dug up Qingdao Mountain, how many Chinese laborers died? Nobody kept count. The Germans paid them in black bread. When they died, they were buried on the spot, buried into the mountain itself, poured over with stone. The filled dirt over at Taiping Mountain. Underneath it all are their bones. The German soldiers waited 90 years for orders. They waited 90 years too, and nothing ever came.
I held the phone, unable to say a single word.
The mountain is alive, Old Joe said. It remembers. It remembers everything.
That was the last time I ever spoke to Old Joe. That winter, Old Joe passed away. His landlord said he went peacefully, just stopped breathing in his sleep. On the bedside table lay a neatly folded blue cloth jacket and an old photograph. In the photo, a young Old Joe wore a military uniform, standing on the battery of Qingdao Mountain, grinning with a mouthful of white teeth. I never went back to Qingdao after that. But sometimes, when I can't sleep at night, I think of that ventilation shaft, of the sound of that orderly line of footsteps beneath the opening, of that bell that waited 100 years for orders that never came. The people of Qingdao call that bell the church bell. But I know, it's not a church bell. It's the mountain's bell. It keeps time for those people under the mountain, keeps the days, keeps the memory that someone still owes them a word, shifts over. Come on up. That's the story. As for you, what do you think? If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. New urban legend every day.